Behind the chapel, a coffin is found, burned, broken, and hiding a body without a face. But who was he? And why did the town try so hard to forget him? Where are you listening from this evening? Share it with us. And let's begin. It was a Tuesday, and not the sort of Tuesday that required remembering. Cloudy but not dramatic, dry enough for pensioners to lean on gates, but not so fine as to coax the brass band from rehearsal. In the small Lincolnshire town of Flaxford, not Flaxborough, mind you, though the comparison was often made and not always kindly. The morning had begun with the usual reports of slugs on dahlias and a mild uproar about the removal of a beloved public bench from outside the chemist's. But by tea time, the conversation had changed. It began, oddly enough, behind the Methodist chapel, where a cluster of flower show volunteers had gathered to disassemble the marquee. Miss Riddle, whose aggressive carnations had once received a letter from Buckingham Palace, not signed by the Queen herself, but close enough, was the first to smell something peculiar behind the wheelie bins. "A dreadful stench," she said, one gloved hand to her nose, the other dramatically clutching the lapel of her floral mac. "Like burnt bacon, or worse." Mr. Bracewell, who had fought in Korea and often reminded people of this fact, even when unprovoked, went to investigate. He returned pale, muttering something incoherent about melting. By the time P.C. Harrow arrived, summoned reluctantly from his crossword in the station kitchenette, it was clear that this was no ordinary case of municipal refuse. Behind the bins, blackened, curled at the edges like a parchment too close to the flame, was what appeared to be a coffin. Not a whole coffin, mind you, not even a clean one. It was scorched, like it had been pulled from a fire halfway through its death throes. The wood, if it had once been varnished, now crumbled to the touch. There were remnants of lining inside, some singed velvet in an alarming shade of burgundy, but there was no nameplate, no inscription, no indication of who it had ever belonged to, and more unsettling still, no face. The corpse, for such it was, had no face to speak of, not disfigured, not decomposed, simply missing. Where the features ought to have been, there was a smooth, waxy plain, like clay smoothed down by an impatient sculptor. The rest of the figure, clothed in what might have once been a suit of decent make, was intact, albeit heat-shrunken. "What in the name of—" Harrow had whispered, already regretting his last sausage roll. By evening, the church doors were locked early, and Mrs. Tidsley, who ran the newsagent, was openly speculating that it might be one of those travellers, or perhaps a London gangland warning. Her husband, Cyril, wisely kept his theories to himself, though he did venture that it might be a film prop, maybe. They use Flaxford for telly, sometimes. At precisely 6:40 p.m., Inspector Purbright received the call while standing in front of his kitchen window, trying to decide whether to have scrambled eggs or simply skip dinner and read a bit of Trollope. He listened without interruption, jotted down 2 notes in the neat block capitals he preferred, and said only, "Right, I'll come along directly." He arrived 10 minutes later, coat buttoned, hat on, umbrella in hand, despite the dry weather. He looked at the coffin, or what remained of it, and then at the silent knot of townspeople gathered behind the chapel's hedgerow. No one spoke, but nearly everyone stared, except for a small boy named Toby, who tugged at his mother's sleeve and said, "Mummy, why doesn't the dead man have a face?" She shushed him, but Inspector Purbright, who'd overheard, nodded gently and said, "That's a very good question." He didn't say it to the child. By nightfall, the news had crept through the town like damp through an old shoe. There was a body behind the chapel, in a burnt coffin. No face, no name, no one missing as far as anyone knew. But wasn't it strange, Mrs. Pollock murmured over her fence, that Mr. Edison hadn't been at the council meeting this week? Very unlike him. He always spoke so fiercely about car park revenues. And wasn't it funny? added Mrs. Braithwaite, who, incidentally, had once dated Mr. Edison for precisely 3 weeks in 1991, that he'd just withdrawn a rather large sum from the Building Society. So large, in fact, that the clerk had made a note in the margins. Inspector Purbright said none of this aloud. He merely stood, quite still, beside the open forensic tent, eyes following the length of a silver button on the charred lapel. Then he turned to P.C. Harrow and asked, quite calmly, "Have we checked if any coffins have been reported missing from the undertaker?" "No, sir." "Should I?" "I think it would be terribly useful, yes." Behind him, the chapel bell rang 6 times, but the body behind the bins had long since stopped counting hours. Inspector Purbright had always maintained that nothing truly dangerous ever began loudly in a town like Flaxford. Even the fires started in silence. It was the nature of such places, to let things fester in the walls, between teacups and hedgerows, until they finally smouldered into daylight. And now he had, quite literally, a coffin-shaped smoulder on his hands, along with a man who had no face and no name. The kind of crime, if crime it was, that had not yet decided what it wanted to become. By mid-morning, the forensic team, 2 men and a woman from the regional office in Granford, had respectfully occupied the area behind the Methodist chapel, laid down plastic mats, and photographed the scorched coffin from angles that Inspector Purbright would later privately describe as near ecclesiastical. He observed quietly as gloves shifted ash, tweezers hovered, cameras clicked. "Nothing in the pockets," muttered the woman, crouching beside the body. Her voice, despite the situation, retained the tone of someone more irked by wool lint than corpse remains. "Clothes are quality, old-fashioned but not moth-eaten. No labels either. Looks like they were deliberately cut out." Purbright raised an eyebrow and said almost to himself, "The kind of man who didn't want to be followed?" The woman glanced up. "You what, sir?" "Nothing," Purbright said gently. "I'm merely thinking aloud. Please continue." At the police station, Sergeant Love had arranged a large printout of a local map on the briefing room wall. A red pin marked the chapel. Another had been added to the offices of Walcott and Sons Funeral Services, the town's only undertakers of record. Purbright returned just after 11 and stood before the map like a man perusing a weather chart. "No reports of missing coffins," Love announced before being asked. "I rang Mr. Walcott himself. He sounded offended by the idea." "Did he really?" "Said, and I quote, 'Our stock doesn't wander off, Sergeant. It gets paid for, carried and interred like good furniture.'" Purbright gave a small smile, rather proud of his merchandise. Love tapped his pen. "There's more. I thought I'd try the crematorium in Yaddlethorpe. They had a delivery go missing last week. A body never arrived. Belonged to a Mr. Henry Coatsworth, name on the papers anyway. Registered from Flaxford, oddly enough, but the address listed doesn't exist. Number 19, Kingsmere Close. There is no number 19, Purbright said quietly. The houses stop at 16. Exactly. They sat with that fact for a moment, the silence absorbing its weight like blotting paper. Then Purbright straightened. "Would you come with me, Sergeant? I think we should take a walk." Kingsmere Close was quiet and unbothered, lined with box hedges and mildly aspirational porches. Number 16 had wind chimes and a cheerful ceramic hedgehog. Number 18, a sagging fence and the faint scent of fertilizer. Number 19, as expected, was a fiction, a numerical ghost that had never existed. They knocked anyway. At 17, at 20, at 18 again. It was at number 20 that they found Mrs. Baines. "Coatsworth?" she repeated, brow furrowing. "No, love, not here. There was a man came about 6 weeks ago, though. Said he was looking to rent something short-term, never gave a name. Thought he might have been with the council. Wore a tie, but not one that knew what it was doing." "Did he mention Kingsmere Close specifically?" Purbright asked. "He had a printout." From the internet, I think. Showed a list of properties, asked if this was number 19. I said it never had been. He seemed confused, or pretending to be. Purbright tilted his head. How so? Well, he kept looking around, at the drains, the bins, the sky even. Then he asked if I thought this end of the street was vulnerable to intrusion. I told him the only thing intruding lately was Mr. Staples' lad and his air rifle. Did you notice what car he drove? Mrs. Baines hesitated. Yes, actually, I did. A grey Rover, bit battered, parked near the old red post box. Thank you, Mrs. Baines, Purbright said, and meant it. Back at the station, they ran the plate number, traced not to a Coatsworth, but a Mr. Franklin Broom, late of Cheltenham, who had sold the car to a private buyer 3 months prior in cash. No receipt, no forwarding address. Later that day the post arrived. In it, an envelope addressed in blue ink, neat capitals, no return address. Inside was a single typed page. No greeting, no signature. It read, "The man in the coffin tried to leave twice. He was warned. He didn't listen. Ask the council about the new budget. Some people cost more alive than dead." Sergeant Love read it aloud, then read it again, slower. Bloody hell. Purbright didn't respond. He was gazing out the window, toward the chapel, or perhaps beyond it. That afternoon the town council held its usual Wednesday meeting. On the agenda, road resurfacing, allotment disputes, and a surprisingly impassioned plea to preserve the duck pond from urban vulgarity. But among the papers was something else. Councilman Edison's chair sat empty. That, in itself, was not shocking. People were occasionally ill, after all. What was unusual was that the clerk, Miss Gladish, had been instructed by Edison himself, via a phone call, to forward his regrets due to urgent private business. He had never failed to attend before, not in 7 years. And when asked what that urgent matter was, Miss Gladish blinked several times and confessed that she hadn't asked. Purbright lingered after the meeting, studying the painted portraits on the chamber walls. A procession of councillors passed, all quietly fading into municipal history. He turned, as if to leave, then paused. Miss Gladish, forgive the question. Did Mr. Edison ever handle any burial grants or discretionary community funds? Anything not widely advertised? The clerk shifted. Yes, actually. He oversaw the Compassionate Rest Fund. Small grants for pauper funerals. Discreet service. How small? £500, capped. And the paperwork? Usually handled quietly. Edison preferred not to trouble the board with uncomfortable matters. Did any of these go to a Henry Coatsworth? She hesitated, then nodded. One. Just 2 weeks ago, Edison signed off himself. Purbright said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was calm. Miss Gladish, would you be so kind as to send me a copy of that grant form? And if you happen to recall anything else, anything odd, from Mr. Edison's behavior that day, do let me know. She agreed. He thanked her, tipped his hat, and walked quietly out. Outside, dusk had begun its slow descent over Flaxford, turning the rooftops slate and the lamplight honeyed. The chapel was quiet again, cordon tape fluttering in the breeze, and somewhere, in a house with locked drawers or behind the tidy ledgers of respectable men, someone knew exactly who had burned that face and why. But not yet, not quite yet. Purbright walked on, umbrella clicking faintly on the pavement. A town like Flaxford didn't give up its secrets easily, but it did, eventually. By Thursday morning, the town had returned, outwardly at least, to its pattern of mild irritation and modest activity. The newsagent was once again out of the Telegraph. The post office queue was already tutting before 9, and Miss Pepperdine at the bakery was spreading the rumor that the faceless body behind the chapel had been a former Russian ballet dancer who'd fallen afoul of tax authorities. Inspector Purbright, who had heard this theory repeated with increasing confidence by 2 retired teachers and a milkman by mid-morning, made no effort to contradict it. He merely nodded, as if contemplating pirouettes and tax evasion in equal measure, then returned to his office. Waiting on his desk, newly arrived and clipped with diligent care, were the files from Miss Gladish, the Compassionate Rest Fund records. A slim folder, too slim, in fact, for a scheme supposedly active these past 5 years. Love noticed it too. "Only 8 recipients," he muttered, flipping pages. 1 per year, all with signatures, all modest sums. Coatsworth's was the last. "And also the only one with a name no one can verify," Purbright murmured. "No family, no real address, no burial confirmed. Doesn't that make it fraud?" "Possibly." Purbright's tone remained gentle. "Or concealment, or theatre." Love frowned. "Theatre?" Purbright didn't elaborate. Instead, he turned back to the file and tapped a finger against one particular document. Coatsworth's grant form. "The handwriting here. It's not Edison's usual scrawl." "You think someone else filled it out?" "I think," said Purbright quietly, "that someone was writing with gloves on." There was a long pause. Then the inspector stood, coat already buttoned. "Come, Sergeant. I feel a civic impulse rising." Their destination was the town crematorium in Yaddlethorpe, a modest, white-bricked facility that smelled of floor polish and floral regret. They were met by Mr. Rokesby, the manager, a man whose cheerfulness seemed both genuine and entirely unsuited to his profession. "Always pleased to help the force?" he beamed, guiding them past a corridor of discreet urn catalogues and into a narrow office with 2 file drawers and a very slow kettle. Rokesby, when prompted, produced the file for the missing Coatsworth cremation. "There we are. Scheduled delivery on the 15th. Never arrived. No follow-up, which was odd. Usually, if there's a delay, the undertakers ring. But nothing. I sent a letter. No reply." Purbright took the file. The body, according to the documentation, was meant to be transported by Gilling and Son, a small funeral outfit recently purchased by the larger Walcott and Sons group. The transport record had no signature. The driver's name was blank. "And this," Purbright said, pointing to a line at the bottom. "What does this number signify?" "Van identification," Rokesby said. "Each transport has a plate number recorded." "That one," he trailed off, squinting, "doesn't match any of the current fleet. Could it have been borrowed?" Rokesby looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Technically, no. But in practice, well, I suppose if someone had a key in the uniform..." Purbright nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you. You've been very helpful." Back in the car, Love exhaled through his nose. Someone stole a body, faked a name, burned the face, and staged a funeral that never happened, all without anyone noticing. Purbright didn't answer. He was watching the road pass by in clean, uneventful stretches of hedgerow and frost-bitten verge. "It takes planning," he said at last, "but more than that, it takes timing. Whoever arranged this knew exactly when, where, and how to go unnoticed. That's not desperation, that's design." They were halfway back to Flaxford when the radio crackled. Harrow's voice buzzed through. "Sir, we've had a call. You'll want to come to the cemetery. It's Edison." They arrived to find 3 officers cordoning off a muddy footpath near the east end of Flaxford Cemetery. Beyond the low wall, a cluster of daffodils bobbed as if in shock. Edison's car, the grey Rover described by Mrs. Baines, sat at an odd angle beneath a yew tree, and in the driver's seat was Councilman Alfred Edison. Dead. The initial glance suggested a heart attack. There was no sign of struggle, no broken glass, no misplaced belongings. Just a man, mid-60s, well-fed and well-pressed, slumped forward in the leather seat with his hands clasped on the steering wheel. The ignition was off, the windows were closed, but then there was the envelope, folded in half and slipped between his fingers as though left there by some small and guilty angel. Purbright took it gently. No stamp, no writing. Inside, another note, typed, plain. He knew what was coming. This is mercy. Some faces are better forgotten. Love stared. Bloody hell again. Purbright sighed. Yes, Sergeant. Quite. It was late afternoon when they finally left the cemetery. The coroner had been called. Edison's body would be examined, though Purbright suspected the cause would be mundane. Poison, perhaps, or a very well-timed cardiac collapse. Not murder in the dramatic sense, but death with meaning nonetheless. At the station, Purbright sat a while in the quiet. He did not light his pipe, though he turned it thoughtfully in his fingers. Love hovered, uncertain. Sir, if Edison was involved in hiding the man in the coffin, why turn up dead? Why not run? Because, Sergeant, Purbright said softly. Running only helps the guilty when they're alone. But Edison was not alone. Love frowned. You think someone was working with him? I think someone used him, and then when the heat arrived, decided that silence, permanent silence, was tidier. There was a pause. Then Purbright looked up. We're missing something. Not motive, not yet a beast, but place. Where did it all begin? Not the chapel. That's where it ended. Not the council either. That's where it was dressed up in paperwork. Love waited. It began, said Purbright, in the house with the fire. Love blinked. Fire. The chapel bins. They're emptied every Monday, yet no one smelled the burning until Tuesday. You're saying the coffin wasn't burned there? I'm saying it was placed thereafter. He stood. We'll need to speak to Mr. Walcott again, but not at his office. I want to see the outbuildings. Outbuildings? His workshop. Where the coffins are built and stored before the viewing room. See them? Where wood and varnish and the smell of smoke are more common than questions. And if he says no? Purbright gave a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Then, Sergeant, we'll simply wait until he wonders why we haven't asked. That night, as the streets of Flaxford drew their curtains and the gossip simmered to a murmur, someone opened a drawer in a quiet house. A paper was taken out, a name scratched from it, a final payment made. And somewhere in the rafters of respectability, another mask slipped into the dark. By Friday morning, the town of Flaxford was swollen with speculation. It clung to conversations like mist on hedgerows. The flower shop assistant swore the faceless man had been a spy. The barber suggested a love triangle turned murderous. Mrs. Entwistle, brushing crumbs from her cardigan in the tea shop, concluded with gravity that it was very likely something to do with pornography, though she would not explain how. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, was reviewing a coffin ledger. Walcott and Sons Funeral Services had cooperated, in the administrative sense, and provided Purbright with access to their storage records. According to the log, no coffins had been reported missing or altered in the past month. Each build was accounted for: name, material, finish, delivery. And yet, as Purbright stood in the sawdust-scented quiet of the workshop, something felt off. I wonder, he murmured, mostly to himself, if a man wanted to dispose of a body and had access to tools, time, and a supply of legitimate materials, would he use a coffin that belonged to someone else, or build one specially? Sergeant Love looked up from the sanding bench. The scorched one didn't look exactly standard. Sir, shorter than usual. Just so? Purbright wandered to the far wall where offcuts were stacked, which means someone wanted it to look like a coffin, but not be one. ceremonial rather than functional. Purbright smiled faintly. Symbolic, Sergeant. Someone wanted to bury a person's identity more than the body. Love glanced toward the back of the room. That door leads to the old fire shelter. Mr. Walcott said it's not used. And yet, Purbright said mildly, it's been unlocked since we arrived. They stepped into a narrow brick passage, barely wide enough for two. The air was still. Purbright sniffed. Char. The smell was faint, but present. Burnt wood, a heat not long cooled. The floor bore traces of something dragged. A smear of ash, a scuff mark from a boot heel. Against the far wall, beneath a draped canvas, stood a coffin, unfinished, unlined. "Who uses this room, Mr. Walcott?" Purbright asked as their host arrived at the threshold, breath short. The funeral director adjusted his tie. "Used to be my father's, sir. He liked his privacy. I'm afraid I haven't much cause to come in." "But someone has," Purbright said, not unkindly. "And recently." Walcott hesitated. "We do have a temporary worker, from the agency. Strong hands, quiet sort." Purbright nodded. "We'll need his name, and where he's staying." That afternoon they found the lodgings. A modest bedsit above the old travel agency, now converted to a nail salon. The name given at check-in had been Gerald Knox. The ID, when checked, turned out to be forged, but the room yielded more. On the windowsill, neatly aligned beside a cup of rainwater, sat a matchbox with the chapel's name printed on it, an odd souvenir, since the Methodist chapel didn't distribute such things. Beneath the bed was a small, soot-stained satchel. Inside, a change of clothes, a burner phone, and a list. 12 names. One was Henry Coatsworth, one was Alfred Edison, one was crossed out, 2 were underlined. "What do you make of this?" Love asked. Purbright studied the handwriting. Neat, decisive. But the style, the loops, the sharp tail of the Y, it struck him as oddly familiar. He held it up beside the note taken from Edison's cold fingers. "Same hand," he murmured. "Sir?" Purbright's gaze was distant. "Whoever left that note, whoever placed it there, they've made a list." "Of what?" "Targets. Witnesses. Debt." He tapped the paper. "Who's next?" Love leaned closer. "The name underlined here. C. Braley. Isn't that the town solicitor?" "Indeed. Retired. Lives on Harrowbank Lane. A widower. Known for writing letters to the advertiser about the perils of roundabouts." "And the other?" Love squinted. "G. Sallow. Don't know the name." Purbright's eyes narrowed. "Neither do I, which makes him even more interesting." They visited Mr. Braley first. He was thinner than memory served, draped in a cardigan the color of neglected celery, and answered the door with the air of a man who still expected milk to be delivered by horse. "Inspector Purbright?" "Oh dear. Have I been libeled?" "Not yet, sir," Purbright said, gently amused. "Might we come in?" Braley led them to a tidy parlor filled with legal books and unopened seed catalogues. When shown the list, he peered at it over his spectacles. "Well now," he said, "that is my name. But I've never heard of the others." "You didn't know Mr. Edison?" "Alfred." "Of course. But I thought you meant the others. Henry Coatsworth. Number, you've never been threatened. Approached." "No," Braley said, frowning. "But now that you mention it, 2 days ago, someone knocked. Said they had a delivery for a Mr. Bracewell. The name's familiar. He's my neighbor. They were insistent, asked to come in and set the parcel down. But I refused, told them to leave it on the step. They went away. Did you see their face? Hardly. Hood up, and there was something odd about the voice. Flat, like a recording. Outside, Love muttered, "Same handwriting, same list." Someone's planning these visits. One's dead, one nearly baited. What connects them? That, Purbright said, is precisely the question. By evening, they turned their attention to the second underlined name, G. Sallow. No address was listed, but Love, persistent, found an employment record at the town library. Sallow had been a custodian there for over 20 years. Retired 4 months ago, left no forwarding address. That's suspicious, Love said. Or sad, Purbright replied. People disappear for all sorts of reasons. It's not always sinister. But the timing struck him. 4 months ago, just before Coatsworth's grant, just before the crematorium paperwork, just before it all began. That night, alone in his office, Purbright spread out the list. He began making his own notes, dates, roles, associations. Edison, councilman; Brierley, solicitor; Sallow, library custodian; Coatsworth, alias; Knox, unknown. And then something struck him. He reached for the register from the Compassionate Rest Fund. Not just the most recent one. All of them. 8 recipients, over 8 years. 2 names matched the list. Sergeant, he called softly through the door. T. Strong, we may be here a while. Love entered with a fresh pot, saw the papers spread, and gave a low whistle. They're all there, he said. Not all, Purbright corrected. But enough. At least 5 of the names on this list were involved, one way or another, with the fund. You think it was a racket? Not in the usual sense, Purbright said. This wasn't about money. At least not only. It was about silence, about cleaning up after something, or someone, without public fuss. Discretion as a service? Precisely. Love pointed to the 2 crossed names. Those were crossed out. Why? Purbright looked up. His eyes were grave. Because they're already dead. And with that, the mystery changed shape. This was no longer about a single burnt face. It was about a circle, a secret one, of people tied by something they had done, and someone was now erasing them. One coffin at a time. Inspector Purbright believed in the value of dullness. A town like Flaxford, he often said, wore its boredom like a woolen vest. Itchy, perhaps, but comfortingly familiar. That was why sudden interest, especially of the murderous kind, stood out so jarringly. And now that he had a list, a quiet, deadly list with names struck, underlined, and soon to be mourned, Purbright felt the first distinct stirrings of fear, not for himself, but for the town, because something methodical was moving through its veins. That Saturday morning, grey and honest as dishwater, brought no respite. Rain fell in a steady vertical rhythm, pooling on window ledges and trickling into drains. Outside the station, even the pigeons looked uncertain. Inside, Sergeant Love was hunched over the map wall, now filled with pins, red for deaths, blue for names, green for unconfirmed links. So let me get this right, he said, tapping a green pin with the back of his pen. Of the 12 names on the killer's list, 5 had received public burial funds. 2 are dead. One's you-know-who in the scorched coffin. 1 is Edison. 2 underlined, one of which we've spoken to. That leaves, what? 4 uncontacted? 3, Purbright said quietly, from behind his copy of the Ecclesiastical Times. One of the remaining names, Maynard, passed away last year. Cancer. Confirmed obituary, Love turned. Natural causes? Very much so. Painful, public and documented. I don't believe he's our man, but I believe he was on the list for a reason. Purbright folded the paper with care, set it aside, and rose. We'll visit Sallow's old employer today, the library. Someone must have known him. Flaxford Library stood like a sleepy ark on the edge of the high street, its sandstone pillars darkened by time and soot. Inside it smelled of dust, floor wax, and the long, low murmur of forgotten things. A tall woman with a loosely pinned bun looked up as they entered. "Good morning," she said without smiling. "Inspector Purbright," he replied gently. "We're looking into the whereabouts of a former employee, Mr. Gordon Sallow. I believe he retired a few months ago." Her name was Mrs. Wilma Tolliver, and she had served as the head librarian for 27 years, although she said this as though it were a punishment. "Sallow," she repeated, eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes, I remember him. Quiet man, tidy, rarely spoke unless necessary. But he did his work. Did he leave suddenly?" "Well," she hesitated. "He gave notice, of course. But yes, it was rather abrupt. Said he was moving away, cleared his things in one afternoon. Did he have any close friends here? Not that I'm aware of. Odd visitors? Unusual behavior?" A pause. "There was one thing," she said slowly. "About a week before he left, he asked to see the microfilm records, specifically the Flaxford Advertiser archives." "For any particular date?" "Several, actually. He was looking up council minutes and obituaries." "Did he say why?" Mrs. Tolliver pursed her lips. "He said something very strange. I didn't think much of it at the time." "What did he say?" She looked at them both. "I'm checking who we buried that never existed." Purbright let that hang in the air. Later, in the library's archive room, he and Love combed through the old newspaper clippings, helped by Mrs. Tolliver's notes. Sallow had reviewed editions from 1995 through 2008. All listed obituaries, most with photographs, all marked with neat check marks beside certain names. And one name appeared twice, not a duplicate, not a relative. The same name, same date of death, 10 years apart. Francis Markwell. "Look here," Love said. "Died in 1998. Pauper's funeral, no next of kin. And again in 2008. Same story." Purbright's finger traced the edges of both notices. "Different photographs. Same birth year. Same middle initial. Is that even possible?" "It is," Purbright said softly. "If someone needed a name, and no one was going to check." By noon, they returned to the station, the rain finally easing to a sullen drizzle. In his office, Purbright arranged the obituaries in a line across his desk. Markwell was not the only name that doubled. 2 others appeared with suspicious regularity, always a decade apart, always as unclaimed or unknown. "Someone's been creating false deaths," Purbright said, "fabricating lives for bodies that don't exist, or shouldn't." "But why? To hide someone who did exist?" Love blinked. "Sir, you don't think that scorched body—" "I do," Purbright interrupted. "It was not meant to be found. It was meant to be buried quietly, anonymously, and finally. But someone made a mistake, or someone interfered." He reached for the phone. "I'm going to need all personnel files connected to the Compassionate Rest Fund since its creation. Clerks, undertakers, transport staff, and I want a copy of the fund's original charter. Not the current version, the very first one." Love nodded and left. An hour later, he returned with a dusty folder and a puzzled look. "You were right. There's something odd in the original charter." Purbright opened it. The first page, neatly typed and initialed by 3 signatures, listed the fund's purpose: to ensure dignity in death for all unclaimed residents of Flaxford Borough, regardless of origin, means, or past. Modest and clear. But the second clause included a provision: wherein exceptional discretion is required, names may be altered to protect reputations or histories of undue embarrassment to the borough. Love whistled. "That's practically a blank check." "Indeed," Purbright murmured, "and one man signed all 8 approvals personally, for 8 years running." "Edison." "No." He tapped the name. "Sallow." "But he was a custodian." "Who handled documents? Who locked the bins? Who controlled access to forms no one else remembered?" He looked up. "I think Mr. Sallow ran a quiet, clever, bureaucratic broom cupboard of death. And someone, Edison perhaps, decided to use it for more than simple charity." But then why kill Sallow? Purbright leaned back. I don't believe they did. I believe Sallow ran. Love was silent. Then, you think he's alive? I think he saw something. Maybe even the last burial. Maybe he objected. And maybe he's the one leaving us notes. The handwriting, the caution, the list. It all feels like a man trying to unpick his own guilt. Just then, a knock. It was Harrow, holding an envelope. This just came in, sir. No stamp. Hand-delivered. Purbright opened it. Inside, another typed message. I won't be next. I left the others behind. But I won't join them. One of them is still pretending to mourn. Underneath was a single sentence. Ask the widow of George Markwell where she puts the flowers. Purbright stood very still. Sergeant, he said, fetch the car. Where are we going? To visit a grave, he said. One that shouldn't exist. And as they drove toward the cemetery, that quiet patch of neatly ordered endings, the rain began again. Lightly this time, as though even the sky was holding its breath, because someone was burying the past, and not all of it was staying dead. The Flaxford cemetery was never locked. It didn't need to be. Its iron gate creaked open like a well-trained butler, allowing quiet entry to those with flowers, regrets, or simply a need to walk somewhere with fewer questions. The newer graves were to the left, neat rows, plastic wreaths, solar lanterns blinking faintly like lost insects. But Purbright turned right, toward the older section, where the stones had begun to lean, and ivy had been permitted to speak. Sergeant Love followed without comment, a folded map of burial plots tucked under his arm. Row N, number 44, he said, squinting at the key. George Markwell died in 2008. And buried, Purbright added quietly, after dying in 1998 as well. They found it soon enough. A simple stone, not recent but not yet weathered beyond legibility. George W. Markwell, 1944 to 2008. Beloved husband, friend, quiet soul. Quiet indeed, Love muttered. There were fresh flowers in a blue vase, lilies trimmed at the stem and angled with care. A note was tucked beneath the ribbon. Purbright plucked it free and unfolded the card. It read only, Tuesday, 4 p.m. I remember. No signature. He looked down at the grave. The dirt had settled years ago, the grass over it patchy but honest. Did you know, he said mildly, that no autopsy was ever performed on this Markwell? Love frowned. What, the 2008 one? No post-mortem, no coroner's hearing, just a certificate signed by a doctor. Elspeth Crundwell, local GP. Recently retired. Lives above the surgery. They stood in the silence for a moment. Then Love asked, Do you think the widow is real? I think, Purbright replied, that someone visits this grave because they must, not because they want to. Back at the station, Miss Brannigan from Records, a woman of admirable suspicion and 3 cats, confirmed that the address listed for Markwell's widow was still active. Mrs. Grace Markwell. Lives in Riverlyn Lane. Tiny bungalow. No complaints, no calls. Pays council tax early. And visitors? Purbright asked. Miss Brannigan gave him a look. We're not the KGB, sir. No, he said mildly. Of course not. They arrived at the bungalow just after midday. The garden was unassuming, a thin trellis of sweet pea vines, a gnome in permanent salute, a bird feeder with no birds. Grace Markwell answered the door in slippers and a beige wool cardigan. Her hair was pinned back severely, though she wore no jewelry, no perfume. She looked somewhere between 65 and death, though not in ill health, merely in stillness. Yes, she asked, blinking at the badges. Inspector Purbright, he said, gently removing his hat. May we come in? She nodded, stepped back and said only, There's tea if you'll have it. The sitting room was immaculate. Not neat, controlled, as though every surface had been auditioned and approved. They sat. She poured. "We're looking into some inconsistencies surrounding your late husband's record," Purbright began, after the usual pleasantries had exhausted themselves. Grace Markwell's eyes flickered. "Which husband?" There was a pause. "George," Purbright said softly. "Ah," she replied, and for a moment something moved in her face. A kind of quiet recognition that settled into her jaw like a pebble dropped into a still pond. "I remember George," she said. "Twice, I expect." She didn't answer that. Instead, she picked up her own teacup and said, "He worked for the borough council, records department, good with numbers, knew how to make things disappear." "Disappear?" "Not destroy," she said. "Just move out of view." Love cleared his throat. "Mrs. Markwell." She waved a hand. "No need, Sergeant. You're circling a truth I've been sitting on for 20 years. I'd rather it be spoken plainly." Purbright nodded. "We believe your husband helped process false burials. Names, dates, identities, all faked. To allow the council to bury people under new aliases. For political reasons, for cover-ups. Or debts," she said. "Or old loyalties. Or people too inconvenient to die properly." Purbright waited. "I wasn't part of it," she went on. "But I knew. When the second George came home, the one from 2008, I knew he wasn't mine." Love's brow furrowed. "He wasn't." She met his eyes. "He looked like him. Spoke like him. But he didn't remember our wedding date. He didn't know what I called our cat. He didn't wince when I slammed the drawer where he once cut his thumb. It was like living with an echo." Purbright sat forward. "So who was he?" "I don't know," she said. "But I know the man I married died 10 years earlier. Quietly, at home, and they took him away. 2 days later, another came back. I was told to accept it. I was told it would be easier. Safer." "By whom?" She hesitated. "A man from the council. Not Edison. Another one. Older, grey beard, smoked Turkish cigarettes, wore a silver tie pin shaped like a swan." Love scribbled furiously. "And did you?" Purbright asked. "Accept it?" "I did what women do," she said. "I adjusted." Outside, a wood pigeon cooed as though embarrassed to overhear. Purbright sipped his tea, set the cup down, and asked, "Who brings the lilies to your husband's grave?" She looked at him. "I do, but only because someone else leaves them at my door every Tuesday. No note, just the flowers." "Do you suspect who?" She gave a small, sad smile. "Sallow." Back at the station, Love paced. 2 George Markwells. 1 dead. 1 placed. That's monstrous." Purbright nodded. "And clever. What better way to hide someone than in plain sight, with a name the town already forgot? But who was the second George? That's what we must discover, and we'll start with the original file." He rang Miss Brannigan. "I need the original personnel file for George W. Markwell, not the one from 2008. The earlier one. If it exists." There was a long pause on the line. "I'll try, sir. But if someone erased it properly, then we'll find the person who taught them how." It was late when the fax machine whirred into life, its voice clumsy and uncertain, like an elderly ghost. A single page emerged. Purbright read it once, then again. "It's blank," Love said, peering. "No," said Purbright, pointing to the bottom corner. "There. Handwritten initials G.S. Sallow. Or someone else who wants us to think so?" And then the phone rang. Purbright answered. A voice, distorted, distant, possibly artificial, said only, "You're too close, Inspector. Don't let the next name be yours." Click. They stood in silence. Then Love said, "What now?" Purbright exhaled. "Now," he said, "we stop watching graves and start watching the living, because the dead may hide secrets, but the living bury them, and someone in Flaxford had been a gravedigger for far too long. The next morning, Flaxford looked the same. That was its trick. The bakery window steamed with jam buns. The town square's flag, damp from night rain, hung in gentle defeat. A dog barked at nothing. But Inspector Purbright knew better now, knew that somewhere behind the painted doorways and polite nods, a truth had been folded, pressed, and shelved for 2 decades like a government pamphlet no one was meant to read. At the station, he stood before the map of names again. One in particular, Gordon Sallow, the ghostwriter, the list-maker. The only one so far not to lie under a stone or behind a silence. Love arrived carrying 2 cups of tea and a folder with a red paperclip. "Sir, I've done what I can. Tracked down everyone in the town register with contact to the original Compassionate Rest Fund. Cross-referenced with cemetery records, death notices, and Markwell's false duplicates. It's tangled." Purbright took the tea. Tangling is good. Tangling can be untangled. Lies are harder when they bump into each other. He flipped open the folder. Inside, a name stood out in clean municipal print. Lionel Swan. "Swan," he said. "Silver swan pin, Turkish cigarettes. You found him?" "Not directly," Love said. "He's off the books, retired long before any of this began, but he shows up in early council archives, assistant clerk of records, then head of discretionary affairs." "Discretionary," Purbright echoed. "Which meant," Love said, "he decided what got recorded and what got politely omitted." "And where is he now?" "That's the odd part. No death record, no move notice, but—" He flipped to the final page. "We did find a lease. A flat registered under a trust fund, right here in Flaxford." "Of course," Purbright murmured. "They always stay close. Control's easier at arm's length." The address was on Wellington Crescent, above the old shoe repair kiosk. The flat bore no name on the bell. Just a number, 2B. Purbright pressed it. After a pause, the buzzer clicked. The door opened without a voice. Inside, the hallway smelled of old tobacco and furniture polish. The walls were lined with prints of alpine lakes and stern women with violins. They reached the 2nd floor and knocked. The man who answered looked precisely as Grace Markwell had described. Grey beard, suit too fine for comfort, eyes like someone who had watched too much and spoken too little. "You've come late," he said. Purbright raised an eyebrow. "I'm not sure we've come at all. That rather depends on your hospitality." The man stepped aside. "Then step in, Inspector, but don't expect tea. I gave up illusions of warmth long ago." They entered a sitting room filled with records. Not vinyl, but ledgers, thick as hymnals. A typewriter sat on a table, its keys covered in silk. "Lionel Swan?" Purbright asked. "I was. Now I'm mostly memory." He sat. "You've been speaking to widows, to graves, to people who left the story half finished." Purbright remained standing. "And which part did you write, Mr. Swan?" "The middle," Swan said calmly. "I inherited the mess, and I added a few pages of my own." He gestured to a locked cabinet in the corner. "That's where the story ends." Love moved toward it, but Swan raised a finger. "Not yet. I want to tell it first. Or some of it. I'm old. Let me have the performance." Purbright nodded. "We're listening." Swan leaned back. "It began, like these things always do, with mercy. A counselor, nameless now, wanted to help a homeless man die with dignity. No family, no ID. So they created one. A name, a story, a quiet ceremony. We buried him as George Markwell, the original. The only one who actually was George Markwell, yes. But then it became a template. Other nameless men followed. We gave them forms, quiet burials, no mess. And then someone realized it could be useful. Edison? Swan nodded. And others. If you could fake a death, you could fake a disappearance. You could pay off debts, end scandals, remove awkward officials. And Sallow? Bright boy, quiet. Thought he was helping people disappear for their own safety. Then he started asking questions. About patterns. Why some of the names came back twice. Why one George Markwell didn't know how he liked his tea. Swan smiled faintly. That was a miscalculation. You threatened him? No, Swan said. He ran before we could. Purbright studied the man. So who is the burned body in the coffin? Swan was quiet for a moment. Then, that, I don't know. But I suspect Sallow does. I think he came back. To undo it. Why? Guilt, perhaps. Or fear. Or both. Purbright stepped to the cabinet. May I? Swan waved a hand. Inside were folders. Black, numbered. One for each of the 12 names on Sallow's list, cross-referenced with aliases, false burials, and handwritten notes. Good Lord, Love muttered. It's all here. All but the final name, Swan said. Purbright turned. What do you mean? I heard from him yesterday. From whom? Swan met his eyes. Gordon Sallow. That evening, back at the station, Purbright sat with the file open before him. Sallow's original employment record, his council access log, and finally, a note, scrawled on the back of an old ledger page. I didn't know who they buried, but I know who arranged it. He'll try again. This town loves neat endings. Underneath was a time, Tuesday, 4 p.m., council chamber, the same time on the note left at the grave, the same time lilies were left at Grace Markwell's door. He's going to confront someone, Love said quietly. Or force a confrontation, Purbright replied. They sat in silence for a while. Then Purbright added, We'll be there, but not obviously. We'll watch. We'll wait. And what if he doesn't come? Purbright stood. He will, he said. People like Sallow always come back to the page they left unfinished. Outside, the lights of Flaxford glowed faintly beneath a rising fog. And somewhere, beneath one of those roofs, a man with a list was deciding whether to finish writing names or finally erase his own. The council chamber had once been a Methodist hall. It still carried that air. High windows that held back more than light, a hush that wasn't silence so much as withheld judgment. On Tuesdays, it played host to bureaucracy, mutterings about pavements, parking permits, and dog fouling. But this Tuesday, Inspector Purbright watched it hold something else entirely. Tension, silent and deliberate, coiled across the room like smoke waiting to be noticed. He and Sergeant Love entered 15 minutes early. Not to attend officially, that would be too conspicuous, but to observe. They took seats on the gallery bench at the rear, behind a polished brass banister and beneath the notice board still pinned with last year's duck pond refurbishment minutes. Only a handful of councillors were present. Miss Gladish, neat as a ledger column, was arranging paperwork. Councillor Hornbeam was already grumbling over the temperature. The mayor, Mrs. Willoughby, arrived in a swirl of scarf and breath mints. But of Alfred Edison, or Lionel Swan, there was no mention. Edison, of course, had taken up his final silence, and Swan, though complicit, had stepped out of the game the moment he'd handed over the black folders. Purbright watched the room with the stillness of someone used to rooms speaking in other ways. He noted the seating, the distance between chairs, the way Councillor Darley didn't look at Hornbeam when he passed him a biscuit. At 3:57, the door opened. The man who entered was not remarkable. He wore a brown corduroy jacket, carried a canvas satchel, and moved with the careful gait of someone who preferred not to be seen, but knew he would be. He walked to the visitor seating and sat in the last chair of the front row. Purbright did not move. That's him, Love whispered. Purbright gave the slightest nod. Gordon Sallow. He looked older than the grainy photo from his employment records. Grayer, thinner, and bent slightly to one side like a man always listening for something at shoulder height. But his eyes were bright, not hopeful, alive, watchful, like a rabbit who'd learned to bite. Miss Gladish called the meeting to order. Minutes were read. A motion was raised about traffic flow near the War Memorial. Sallow said nothing. It wasn't until 4:11 that the moment came. A councillor, Purbright didn't catch the name, mentioned the Compassionate Rest Fund in passing. A reallocation of surplus. Nothing major. Routine, really. That's when Sallow stood. "I object," he said. Every head turned. Even Miss Gladish blinked. "I object," he repeated, "to the reallocation of funds gathered through fraud, silence, and murder." Gasps are rarely audible in reality. But here, the sound was real. Not shock exactly, but the kind of discomfort that pulls at lapels and settles into spines. Mrs. Willoughby, flustered, stood. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is not—" "You buried 12 people," Sallow said. "Some more than once. Some who were never dead. Some who never existed." Purbright watched the reactions. Darley's shift, Hornbeam's cough, Miss Gladish's frozen hand halfway to her glass. "I have names," Sallow said, pulling a folder from his satchel. "Dates, payments, witnesses." Miss Gladish spoke softly. "Mr. Sallow, please—" "I built the paperwork," he said. "I built the coffins with words. I stamped lies. I filed ghosts." There was silence. Then Councillor Darley said, "You were dismissed for mental instability, Mr. Sallow." I urged the room not to entertain. "You dismissed me," Sallow said sharply, "because I asked why George Markwell didn't flinch when I slammed the archive drawer." That landed like a dropped teacup. Purbright rose. "Mr. Sallow," he said calmly, stepping forward. "May I speak with you outside?" Sallow turned. His expression softened slightly. "You're Purbright?" "I am." He handed the folder over without a word, then, as though deflated, sat again. The room sat stunned. Outside in the corridor, Purbright opened the file. More lists, more annotations. A final note clipped on the inside. "I know who the body was. I was told to keep it quiet. I will testify. It was signed, Gordon Sallow." Behind them, inside the chamber, the councillors began murmuring. Distantly, a chair scraped, paper rustled. But none of it sounded like denial. Back at the station, Purbright and Love sat with the file. Piece by piece, the truth arranged itself. The body in the coffin. Not Coatsworth. That had been the alias chosen for convenience. The real identity, Thomas Greaves. A name absent from public records, but present in internal memos from 2007. A low-level municipal officer under quiet investigation for embezzlement. The inquiry had vanished. So had Greaves. "Why kill him now?" Love asked. Purbright stared out the window. "Because he came back. Or tried to." He tapped one page. A lease application under his real name. Submitted 3 weeks ago, flagged by the same office that once erased him. "You think Edison panicked? Or someone higher up did? Edison may have acted as executioner, but someone else ordered the sentence. And now Sallow's pulled the sheet off the body." "Not yet," Purbright said. "He's given us the string. We still have to pull." At that moment, the phone rang. Love answered, listened, then held it out. "For you, sir. Anonymous." Purbright took it. The voice was low, filtered. "Tell Sallow to run again. He won't get a second meeting." Click. They stared at each other. "He's in danger," Love said. "No," Purbright replied. "He was in danger. Now he's bait." That night, Sallow vanished. His flat above the nail salon was empty, the satchel gone, the bed cold. But on the table, a note. "I'm not running. I'm going to the chapel. I want them to find me before the fire does." Purbright closed the note slowly. "Come on, Sergeant. To the chapel. To the heart of it." Outside, Flaxford slept, but not well. Because somewhere, a man with too much to hide and too many friends in official chairs was preparing to strike again. And this time, Purbright feared, the coffin wouldn't be empty. The chapel had once stood for silence. Not the mournful kind, but the devout. The quiet of knees on cushion, hymn sheets rustling, breath held for organ notes. Now, on this pale and bitter Tuesday evening, its silence felt different, more like waiting, or warning. Inspector Purbright arrived just after dusk. The air was sharp, the kind that made windows speak in clicks and radiators whisper of age. The Methodist chapel, modest and square, was dark but not lifeless. A light flickered in the vestry window. "Wait here," he told Sergeant Love, who was parked discreetly across the road with a flask and a set of binoculars he neither needed nor liked. "If anything moves, follow it, but not too fast. This isn't a chase. Not yet." Purbright approached the chapel on foot, each step muffled by damp leaves. The door was unlocked. No surprise there. This was Flaxford, after all, where locks were more social than secure. Inside, the smell of dust and hymnals greeted him, layered faintly with the memory of last year's bake sale. The vestry door was ajar, and inside sat Gordon Sallow. He was seated at the old oak desk, the kind once used for keeping ledgers and mild heresies. He wasn't hiding, nor did he look afraid. He looked resolved, like a man who had waited 20 years to tell one truth and was now deciding how many more he could carry. "They sent you," he said. Purbright closed the door behind him. "Number you sent yourself. I'm just trying to keep you from becoming your own evidence." Sallow nodded toward the desk. A folder lay open, its contents fanned like a hand of cards. Purbright stepped closer. Documents, typed, annotated, burial orders, identity swaps, a list of names with corresponding municipal codes, initials, abbreviations, dates, some crossed out, some circled. "This," Sallow said, "is the full account." Purbright didn't sit. "And what are you hoping to do with it?" "I don't know," Sallow replied. "Some nights I think I'll give it to a newspaper. Others I imagine leaving it in the vestry pew and walking into the sea, but tonight I thought maybe I'd wait here. See who comes first? You or them?" Purbright took the top sheet. "Thomas Greaves, the real name of the burned man." Sallow nodded. "He worked with them. Then he tried to leave. I was told to disappear him. I filed the paperwork, invented Coatsworth, set up the cremation that never happened. But Greaves never made it to the fire. Because he changed his mind. Because someone else did. They killed him, Inspector, in that workshop, lit the coffin afterwards, and then left him behind the chapel like bad rubbish." Purbright's gaze lingered on the names. "Edison, only a cog. The real mind was Swan." Purbright didn't flinch. "He says he retired." Sallow gave a soft, brittle laugh. "He never retired. He just moved from ink to whisper. He thinks guilt is a filing error. Thinks if you die quietly, you are never dangerous. You think he's coming tonight?" "I know he is." Purbright looked at him. "And you?" "I'm tired, Inspector, but not foolish. I've packed everything. If he comes, I want you to hear what he says. He won't expect you." There was a long pause. Only the creak of the building filled it, old wood groaning at old lies. Then a sound, a car. Purbright moved to the window, a black saloon, idling across the road. No headlights, just engine breath in the cold. "He's here," Sallow said. Purbright turned off the vestry light. "Get in the back, leave the door open a crack." Sallow obeyed. 5 minutes passed, then footsteps, calm, confident. The chapel door creaked once, then the sound of shoes on tile, then silence. Swan entered like a man walking into his own history. He looked older than he had that day in the flat. Older by decades, as if some weight had finally broken surface and now sagged him toward the floor. "Sallow," he said. "You've made a mess." Sallow remained hidden. Purbright watched from behind the side curtain. "A public confrontation," Swan continued, walking slowly toward the vestry. A folder handed over, the inspector involved. And now here you are, waiting in a church like a child confessing his first lie. He reached the desk and saw the folder. His fingers hovered but didn't touch. You don't know what these names meant, what they covered, the kind of stability they brought, the kinds of collapses they prevented. You think you're lifting a rock, Gordon, but all you'll find is what kept the ground from falling in. He sighed. Greaves was sloppy. Edison was emotional. But I always did the paperwork. The real crime, you see, is disorder. From behind the curtain, Purbright stepped forward. But disorder, Mr. Swan, has a way of reordering itself. Swan turned slowly. His face remained unreadable. "Inspector, you came here to finish Sallow. I suggest you sit instead." "I came here," Swan said quietly, "to clean the ink. That's all. I thought he might be willing to listen." "He's done listening," Purbright replied. Sallow stepped out from the back. "I kept copies of everything." Swan looked at him for a long time. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. "Then I suppose I've run out of lines." Outside, the car's engine died. Another set of footsteps approached. Purbright moved to the door. "Sergeant," he called calmly. Love entered with 2 uniformed officers. "Mr. Swan," Purbright said, "I'm arresting you on suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, falsification of death records, and unlawful burial procedures. You do not have to say anything." "No," Swan interrupted, "but it's nice to finally be named." As he was led out, Sallow remained still. Only when the footsteps faded did he speak. "Will it change anything?" Purbright looked at the folder on the desk. "It already has." That night, as the chapel lights dimmed and Flaxford settled once more into the illusion of calm, a truth long buried had been exhumed. Quietly, without spectacle, but fully. The names on the list would find light. The false graves would be marked, and a file, copies and all, would go to the chief superintendent in the morning, accompanied by a note that read, "Let the dead bury the dead. The rest I'll see to myself." The wind that moved through Flaxford the next morning felt different. Not sharper or colder or more insistent, but cleansed somehow, as though the town had exhaled something it had been holding for too long. Yet even with the arrest of Lionel Swan and the quiet detonation of his reputation across the broadsheets, there remained a silence in the town's voice. People walked a little more slowly. Conversations paused more often. And in the corners of tea shops and under awnings at the market, the name Gordon Sallow was spoken like a ghost that had forgotten to stay dead. At the station, Inspector Purbright read the morning's headlines with his usual dispassion. "Death in the records, council scandal." "Unearthed," said the Flaxford Advertiser. "Names of the buried, conspiracy in a quiet town," announced the Granford Echo. The tabloids were more colorful. One had superimposed Swan's mugshot over a cemetery gate with the caption, "The Man Who Buried Truth." Purbright folded the paper in half. "A bit much," he murmured. Sergeant Love arrived, carrying 2 mugs and a folder stamped URGENT. "They've gone through Swan's flat," he said, setting both down. "Found more ledgers, lists of names that never made it to burial. All encoded, of course. But I've asked Brannigan to start matching initials to property records. And Sallow. Hiding for now. With your approval, I've kept his name out of the press. He's asked for protection until everything's formal." Purbright nodded. "He's not the villain. Just the one who got tired of being used by them." Love hesitated. "And Greaves. The inquest will take time, Purbright said. But we know this. He tried to resurface, tried to reclaim his name. That's what cost him his face and his life. Do you think Edison did it personally? No, said Purbright. Edison was a manager of fear, not a maker of it. He handled the details. But someone else lit that fire, someone who hasn't yet been named. He rose, walked to the window. Greaves knew things, dangerous things. Things Swan and his circle didn't want recorded in any archive, no matter how silent. Love opened the folder. Then you'll want this. Inside was a document, a single page, torn from one of Swan's confiscated ledgers. It listed numbers, times, codes, and one word written carefully in the margin. Shadow Ledge. Purbright frowned. That's not a name. No, said Love. It's a location, a farmhouse. 5 miles outside town. Purbright's gaze remained fixed on the paper. I've never heard of it. Exactly. That's the point. 2 hours later, they were on a narrow country road bordered by hedgerows too high for their own good. The sat-nav, which Purbright distrusted on principle, had stopped offering advice a mile back. Now they followed instinct and the half-remembered notes from a council development map Love had found in a storage drawer, labeled Miscellany and Dog Fouling Zones. Shadow Ledge Farm came into view like a confession, squat, grey and sunken into the land. The gate was open. The drive was gravel, but long untended. No visible car, no livestock. Only the faint smell of damp hay and the oddly chemical tang of something that had no place in agriculture. They parked and approached on foot. This place wasn't on any council register, Love said quietly. Because it wasn't for the council, Purbright murmured. It was for those who ran it. The front door was locked, but not well. A firm push from Love's shoulder opened it. Inside, the smell was stronger. Not rot, not mold, paper, old paper, dried leather, chemical toner and printer ink, and something else, the electric whir of climate control. The farmhouse, it turned out, was a facade. The front rooms were dusted, unused, but the rear, once stables perhaps, had been converted into an archive. Rows upon rows of filing cabinets, storage boxes, coded shelves. An underground warren of bureaucracy. Good God, Love muttered. It's a second council office. No, Purbright said. It's the real one. He walked to a cabinet labeled 2002 to 2009, Compassionate Rest, Shadow Ledge files. Inside were folders, dozens, each marked with an initial, a date, and a note. SG, cremation, redirected BD. Family notified posthumously, TG, identity secured, burial faked, watch list. He froze. TG, Thomas Greaves, he said aloud. The file was thicker than the rest. Inside, an ID photo, records of disciplinary, proceedings, a report of suspected fraud, then a note, unsigned, recommending his removal via transfer protocol, with final documentation filed through Sallow's channel. Love read over his shoulder. They made him disappear through paper. Twice. And when he tried to return, Purbright said, they made him disappear in fire. Another folder caught his eye. AR, cooperative, paid silence, closed file. AR? Love asked. Purbright opened it. Inside was a photo. Miss Gladish, he said softly. Love blinked. The council clerk. A.R. Gladish. Annabelle Ruth. She filed the notes. Signed off on silence payments. She was one of them. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Purbright closed the file. We'll need to bring her in. Back in Flaxford, the sky was beginning to darken again. Rain threatened, but didn't deliver. The council office, as they entered, was winding down for the day. Miss Gladish was at her desk, typing slowly. Inspector, she said with a polite nod. Sergeant. We'll need to speak in private, Purbright said. She did not ask why. In the side room, he laid the file on the table. "I assume," he said, "you'd prefer not to be arrested in front of the mayor." Miss Gladish looked at the folder, then at her hands. "They told me it was for order," she said, "that if certain people disappeared quietly, it was kinder, no scandal, no grief." "Who told you that?" "Swan, Edison, and others I never saw." "Greaves?" "He was never meant to return. When he did, I knew it would collapse." "So you burned him?" "No," she said quickly. "I couldn't. I told Swan. I told him I wanted out." "And he said?" "He said I'd be next." Purbright studied her. "You're going to testify?" She hesitated, then nodded. "If it helps end it." Outside, the town went on. Bread was bought, dogs barked, a boy kicked a can into the gutter with no sense of history at all. But inside the council, and beneath the town's most routine silences, a reckoning had begun. A clerk had spoken, a list had unraveled, and a name that once meant nothing, Greaves, now meant everything. The final week of October settled over Flaxford like ash, grey, quiet, lingering in doorways and hedges. The market stalls folded earlier than usual. The streets emptied before sunset. It wasn't fear exactly, but a kind of communal unease, as if the town itself was processing something it couldn't yet admit. Inside the police station, Inspector Purbright sat alone in the incident room. The map was still pinned to the wall, now more scarlet string than surface. Names had been crossed out, new ones added. Paperwork bloomed like fungus on every table, but the true shape of the case, the heart of it, had already emerged. He stared at the name in the center of it all. Thomas Greaves. A man not buried properly, not twice, not once. A man erased by signatures, then scorched to silence. But in doing so, they had left behind the very thing they'd tried to avoid: attention. Purbright reached for his notebook and flipped to the final page. There, in his own clean handwriting, were the last steps of the puzzle. 1. Greaves resurfaces under real name. Second red flag triggered by clerk Annabelle Gladish. Third Edison contacts Swan. 4. Swan arranges reburial. 5. Greaves murdered. 6. Coffin burned in undertaker's storage, body left at chapel. 7. Face destroyed to prevent identification. 8. Sallow discovers truth. 9. Swan attempts cover-up. It was all there. All but one thing. Why now? Why, after decades of silence, had the machine misfired? That answer came, as they so often did in Flaxford, by accident. A minor clerk at the council, a nervous young man with hair like a startled crow, had found a letter, unposted, buried beneath a stack of defunct pension forms. He brought it to Sergeant Love, who read it, frowned, and placed it in Purbright's hands without a word. It was from Thomas Greaves, addressed to the Flaxford Gazette. "To whom it may concern, my name is Thomas Greaves. I once worked for the council. I'm not dead, though my records may say otherwise. I'm willing to speak, but I need protection. I have copies. I have names. I have nothing left to lose." It was dated 2 days before his body was found. He'd been preparing to expose everything, not quietly, not slowly, publicly. That was the final trigger. "Swan didn't kill Greaves," Purbright said aloud, almost surprised to hear his own voice. Love looked up. "Sir." Purbright rose, the letter still in his hand. It was Gladish. She intercepted the letter, knew what it meant, and she panicked. She'd kept the files, knew the names, and knew she'd be exposed. But she said she wanted out. She did, but only after the damage. She killed Greaves to protect herself, then went to Swan for help cleaning up. He covered it out of habit, not loyalty. They brought her in later that afternoon. She didn't cry. She didn't deny it. "He asked me to type it," she said softly. "The letter. He trusted me. We had worked together once, long ago. He even bought me tea when my mother passed." She folded her hands. "I burned him. I didn't mean to. I just wanted him to vanish again, to stay gone, but he woke up." There was a silence after that. Not from shock, but something quieter. Something resembling pity. "He wasn't dead when you lit the fire?" Purbright asked. Her lips trembled. "I thought he was." A day later, the papers ran the full story. The advertiser called it "The Coffin Without a Face." The Granford Echo chose a bleaker title: "Buried Twice, the Town That Forgot to Bury Its Guilt." Gordon Sallow, now under witness protection, gave a statement to the chief superintendent. His name was cleared. His list became evidence. He declined all interviews. Swan was charged with conspiracy, destruction of records, and obstruction of justice. He pled guilty. His final remark in court was, "I preferred the dead." They were simpler to manage. Annabel Gladish was charged with murder. She pled guilty without condition. "I didn't kill him because I hated him," she told the court. "I killed him because I was too afraid to let the truth be read." It was all, in the end, very tidy. Too tidy, perhaps. But Purbright knew that was the way of such matters. The truth, when forced into the open, never shouted. It stood quietly, waiting to be seen. On the Friday of the following week, Purbright walked past the chapel. It had been reopened, the vestry repainted. No plaque had been hung, no mention of what had happened. But someone, anonymously, with neither pride nor shame, had left a small wooden cross beside the hedge. Carved into it were 3 words he remembered first. Purbright stood beside it for a long time. Later that evening, back at the station, he found himself looking once more at the original list of names Sallow had typed. All 12, all meant to vanish. But now they would not. Each name would be reviewed, each file reopened, each silence accounted for. Love entered with 2 cups of tea and a biscuit tin that had seen better decades. "Quiet day," he said. Purbright nodded. "That's how you know it worked." He took the tea, then glanced out the window toward the square, where children were playing beneath the hanging baskets, and someone was setting up a table for the winter book fair. "Do you think they'll remember it?" Love asked. "The town," Purbright sipped. "They'll remember what's useful. The rest will settle, as all things do. But it will change them, just a little. It always does." Love leaned back. "Still strange, though. A whole man buried in paper." "No," Purbright said. "A whole system buried in a man. Greaves just happened to be the last page." There was a knock on the door. A junior constable entered, sheepish. "Inspector, sir, there's a Mr. Peabody here. Says he's missing a cat. Wants to know if someone's moved the municipal compost heap." Purbright stood, reached for his coat. "Back to normal, then." And with that, he walked out. Not into triumph, not into applause, just into the town, where the wind blew quietly, where the flowers outside the chapel leaned toward the road, where Gordon Sallow had once filed names like secrets, and where, for the first time in years, the silence wasn't covering anything at all. The end.